Greetings everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of this course, MO2, Intro to College Writing. I'm Professor Talarico. Today what we're going to be doing is taking a trip through the coddling of the American mind. Two authors on this, Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, and I've seen him quite a bit. If you go on YouTube, I think he's done some TED Talks based on this article. This article, I think, was kind of a fairly successful article, well-read, widely read article. So it'll really just be a walkthrough of this piece. To say just a couple things about it, I think this is one of the more important articles I've read over the last 5 to 10 years. I've been teaching it for a while, which is why it's nice to sit down and put together a lecture based on the material, because looking back through my annotations here, I've just realized how much I've gone through this with classes and with students before. So that's a good thing. And I think it's important because it speaks to the conversations, the tone of the conversations, the overall climate of the conversations that we have, and the different perspectives that we share, is this idea of political correctness. And maybe that's a term you're familiar with. Maybe that's a term you're not so familiar with. I think one of the benefits of reading this article is we find out more about what that is and what it means in educational environments. So to start with, when you read through this, it's told in a certain, it's written in a certain way, so as for these two authors to best support their idea. You know, everything we read, everything that's written arguably is persuasive writing, even the poems and the short stories and the fiction that we read. And of course, in MO2 we deal with nothing but nonfiction, right? So we're reading about real people, real places, real things. And so one thing we learn early on in this piece, and one thing I appreciate it, is all this anti-harassment stuff and why there is this political correctness in the first place. We recognize through some of the ideas they share here that political correctness is a good thing, that there's a real well-meaning intention to it, there's a real virtue to it, there's a real benefit that we get from it. But what these authors are going to do is really make us think counterintuitively to that. They're going to make us think how this can be taken too far. And I think some of us have probably seen that this has been, part of the news, and people having major disagreements and ways of expressing that. So I want to really quickly just outline what is anti-harassment speech, bullying, and what are the grounds that it's kind of found on, the grounds that it's found on. And here it is. For instance, disability, right? If you start harassing somebody because of the fact that they have a disability, there's real laws in place, and I believe this is Title IX, right? And you read about that in this article. And these are major important things, statutes that educations, whether universities, colleges, or even high schools and everything kind of there, have to deal with, which is they can't have harassment of certain individuals who fall into these categories, and I'll go through them quickly. Disability, gender, right, male, female. Another one is gender identity, right, so what you actually kind of identify as, right? Gender expression, so there's lots of stuff going on there. Nationality, race or ethnicity, there's the one that we hear a lot about. Religion, sexual orientation, right? And even association with a person or group with one or more of these actual or perceived characteristics. And the last one I want to put on that list that is here is age. So these are all the different categories that anti-harassment laws protect, right? People who fall into these categories. So I know for me that was somebody who works in education. I teach full-time at a high school, I teach community college part-time. So I needed this as a refresher. I felt like that was one of the benefits of reading this article. Now, how do they prove their points in this? It's largely share important terminology and definitions with us as the readers here. Then they follow up with kind of a lot of different examples. One criticism I've heard from students over the years of this piece is the examples that these authors choose to use are quite extreme. They're quite dramatic. They're quite silly and kind of preposterous at times. And I'll let you be the judge of that. If you think they're just kind of cherry picking, as the expression may go, they're examples, right, to really prove how outrageous political correctness has gotten in colleges and universities. But I'll let you be the judge. So I'm going to get right into this. And they speak to the movement that is protecting or there to enforce, let's say, Title IX, right? And that's what we just covered. Harassment, anti-harassment, anti-harassment laws falling on all those various categories, right? And this has obviously led to a lot of people feeling the need to protect groups of students in general, so that nobody is harassed, right? So we have to watch what people say. Now, I think as we get this conversation started, and I'll be quick, a great way to understand political correctness and who stands on the two far lines of this entire spectrum, right? Where we have people who think you have to kind of, dare I say, censor, or at least definitely be careful with what the freedom of speech and what people are allowed to say. And then you got people who are going to advocate on the far end of that, that you should be allowed to say whatever you want, right? Because there's various ways, even outrageous ways of getting important points across. So I think if you're thinking about that spectrum of political correctness, those who agree with it and kind of live by it, adhere to it, those that don't and live by going against it, the best groups of people to think about, I think on one end, the people who have to kind of live by it is someone like myself. Professors, whether high school and lower or college universities, are usually, and there's so many reasons for this that I don't have the time to get into, and it would be better with a discussion anyways. There's so many reasons why teachers, professors, instructors find themselves having to take on pretty kind of a high-minded stance on political correctness, right? You really do have to adhere to it. It's a part of your professional curriculum, like people know, the development that you go through, the work sessions and the training that you go through. Trust me, especially nowadays, it's a huge deal. But there's teachers and professors. I think those are a great example of people who really do adhere to political correctness. We're talking about education here. And they talk about a great group, just on the first page, of people who are the total opposite, and a good way to understand it is comedians. Your Chris Rocks, your C.K. Lewis's, your Kevin Hart, not so much nowadays, but his early comedy. And notice Kevin Hart's gotten in trouble for saying things that weren't so politically correct if you start to look at the news. Again, no time to really get into it. So comedians, especially the edgy ones, especially the ones that push the envelope and say the things like Louis C.K. Says some stuff like, I can't even believe the stuff he says. I think he's incredibly funny at times, but he really goes out there on a limb and he says some things that offend people. But is he really just performing art and there's kind of a different meaning behind it? You be the judge. Everyone seems to form their own opinions on these things. So two good groups to think of when you think of who's politically correct: teachers. Who's not? Comedians. A great group of people to think of. And what's mentioned here is some of these comedians, like Jerry Seinfeld and Chris Rock, refuse to go on college campuses, which are the kind of ground zero of political correctness because of the educations young people are receiving, and the, let's say, passion and the energy that we find in college campuses as well, that it may be dedicated toward these issues. So some of those reasons. Now, like I said, what this author tends to do is give us terminology and then follow up with examples. Before reading this article, I'll be honest, years and years ago, I had never heard of any of these things. This truly was news to me. Some of you maybe have heard of these things, such as microaggressions. Microaggressions are things that you might not think are so harmful that you may say to somebody, but they can interpret it for a meaning that might be harassment, right? And they give a lot of examples of this. Like, for instance, if you say to an Asian American student, you must be good at math because of the stereotype that resides there, that would be a microaggression, right? He shares another one here, and this is just through memory because I've taught this and read through this so many times, but where do where do you come from? Which somebody might say means, oh, you mean I'm not from here, and see that as kind of a comment against them or a harassment of where they come from, nationality, which was on that list, Title IX, that we talked about a moment ago, right? The authors are truly worried. I don't think they work in education. I think they work in the fields of like psychology and sociology. I think that's where they come from. But they're worried about colleges and universities essentially becoming institutionalized with this new cultural, politically correct climate in mind, that this is going to take over, that we're going to have to be incredibly careful of what we say, how we say things, but that's going to then directly impact student learning, right? And that's largely what this article is about. A lot of terminology shared here, throughout this article, such as another term, vindictive protectiveness, which means that vindictive means I want revenge, right? This kind of need for revenge, but protective means I'm trying to protect. So it's a bit of an oxymoronic term, quite ironic. But it means that I'm going to be preemptive in stopping you from saying something that I think might harm me or others. So before you even say it, I'm gonna prevent you from being able to say it because I'm worried about other people and I'm protecting them. This is very relevant. I think we're spending so much time online. We all have our different places where we go and watch things, interact with things, whatever it might be. But we hear a lot about censorship online and some of these big tech companies that are in control of the censorship. They're being urged by other organizations, institutions to censor and be very careful with material. And I ask you, the student, the question, do you think that is an infringement on free speech? What's your opinion, right? This is a major debate we have. Net neutrality, I don't know how that factors in, but there's so many big topics that go into how we interact online and what's capable and the restrictions that are in place, etc. Very worried about students, the authors, in the sense that if we are going to protect students from what they read, what they're exposed to, right, ideas, then how is that going to impact them, right, if they aren't given these ideas in the first place? There's a line here on page 45 of the article, and it's a good line. I didn't say much about it in my first annotations, but it says, this critical questioning that we do, right, where we sometimes like share opinions in class or share certain ideas that maybe are new or uncomfortable, etc. What they say, what the authors say about that, they say that's a part of the process. That should be a part of the classroom. Such questioning, I'm reading here, such questioning sometimes leads to discomfort, like when a teacher or a professor or even another student in class share a perspective or an opinion and you're like, I don't like that idea, I don't agree with that. Like, I really don't agree with that at all. Well, what they're saying is that kind of stuff should happen, even to anger, because all of this leads to a certain understanding of at least the other side of the argument, or who knows what that could lead to. So unless you're ready to hash it out, a discussion, a debate, a dispute, something about ideas, whatever it could be, our society, right, whatever, unless you're willing to kind of hash it out, debate it, have the friction, T.S. Eliot talks about this in an essay he writes, have the friction of people disagreeing with each other, then you're not going to really see any understanding develop on with any party that's involved here, right? And that's really how the authors see it. How do you see it? Do you agree with them? They talk about the 1990s, which is the era of protectiveness and self-esteem building for parents and young people, their children in the 1990s. I am, for the most part, born in 81, and definitely, young kid throughout the 90s, young teenager throughout the 90s. I feel 90s was a good decade, but whatever. But I agree with, it's funny to read this because I did have that kind of, they call it free-range childhood. I remember, just being out in the neighborhood, could have been my family situation, but till all hours, 9 o'clock, maybe even a little later, who knows, 9 p.m., 10 p.m. at night, and my parents weren't hovering over me. Now, I didn't live in a necessarily dangerous area. I definitely came from a suburb outside of Rochester, New York. But nowadays, when I live in California and, see the neighborhoods here, you don't see kids out that late just roaming around. It's a very different vibe. It's a very different awareness that we all have now. And there's reasons for this. And they talk about it here. In short, these reasons are, child abductions, crime. There's increases in crime in the 90s. Parents throughout, the country are made aware of this, and they start to pull in the reins on their children a little bit more for the sake of safety, right, and bring them in. Crazy. The milk bottles they talk about here on milk cartons, especially the half-gallon ones, whether they're made out of paper, cardboard, whatever. For those of you who are my age, close to 40 here, you remember seeing the faces on the milk cartons when you were a kid, and the Runaways. Google or YouTube the song Runaway Train by, the name's going to escape me, a 90s band. The name's going to escape me, but it's called Runaway Train, and it was a song in a music video that was all about young people that have been lost to the streets and have ran away, and we just don't know where they are, and it's quite sad. And that was the era. Imagine seeing that as a parent, is what the authors say here. And the 90s also becomes this era of self-esteem as well, right? Zero tolerance policies are put into place, right? Some of us grew up with those in high school, right? Which makes any form of misconduct or kind of bad behavior immediately punishable, right? So the rules are tightened. This is a great point. He says, this is also page 45, that we are a very politically polarized culture, which means that Democrats and Republicans, more than ever, you think about the election we just got through, and it's not really over yet, right? We have a president-elect Joe Biden, but we're not, he's not there yet. But the feelings and the animosities the authors mention here is extreme between Democrats and Republicans. They say even almost as much as, say, racial kind of tension, right? Black, white, black, Mexican, Hispanic, Latino, whatever it's going to be, right? So that's how powerful this kind of vitriol can be between Democrats and Republicans, right? And these negative, antagonistic feelings that they have toward each other. So this is the kind of culture that we're growing up in as well. They talk about morality binds and blinds, which just means that as soon as I say, man, I'm a Democrat through and through, and let's say hypothetically, totally hypothetically, I was saying, I don't like Trump. I don't like Trump at all. I'm a Democrat. I'm going to vote against this guy. But the more I say I'm a Democrat, I blind myself to any other perspective, whether it be on politics in general, the Republican Party, Donald Trump. Same is true of a Republican. As soon as I bind myself to that team and say, red, right, Republican, I am blinding myself to any other kind of possibility that's out there, any way of other way of seeing it, right? And that's largely true. A lot of people have been talking about that for a long time, right? That idea, that kind of group think, right? As soon as you become a part of a group, you really do cancel out a lot of other possibilities in terms of mindsets. All right, so I love how they talk about Marcus Aurelius, because they go back to Stoicism, and there's some great lectures online, on YouTube even, where you can find out more about Neo-Stoicism, Stoicism, and it goes back to Marcus Aurelius. If you're looking for a cinematic visual on Marcus Aurelius, go to Gladiator. I just bought it on 4K. I should watch it. And the emperor in that film who's dying, and Maximus kind of spends time with him a little bit in the middle of the film, that's Marcus Aurelius, and he is heralded as one of the better emperors, and he has the theory of Stoicism. In short, why is Stoicism necessary as a philosophic mindset in the early early time period. We're talking about kind of Roman culture here, mainly because life was so fleeting. There was so much violence in the world back then. Even as a child, you were probably used to seeing a lot of violence and life being snuffed out, disease, you name it, all around you. I think we all have to stop and say, thank goodness we live in the era we do, and it's not great in many parts of the world. But you know, when you think about the way the world used to be, it was very brutal. So in a way, you had to emotionally distance yourself from a lot of things happening in the world, especially connections you had to people, right? Because they might not be there the next day and you still have to kind of press on and keep going. For instance, I know some family members of mine, extended family, who lost, you know, like a relative, and the grief hits us hard, right? And the grief could throw you down, especially if you were very close to the person that you lost. It could throw you down for a week. It could throw you down for 5 weeks. It could throw you down for 5 months. It could throw you down for 5 years. But the idea of Stoicism and mindfully creating emotional distance from you and people that are important to you is when that person does go, because inevitably they will go, you are ready to deal with that blow so that it doesn't prevent you from moving forward. And maybe even moving forward in a more efficient and effective way because you've prepared for it. So that's the real kind of reason, the raw reasoning behind Stoicism here. But the authors are advocating a kind of neo-Stoicism, right? That it does help to, they're not talking about necessarily loss of life, but loss of confidence, loss of insight when you're having those discussions and those difficult debates with other people about important ideas. That you, in a way, go into it without your emotions intact. So you have kind of an objective way of really handling that thinking process, right? And you don't let all these cognitive distortions, which is what they talk about, get involved. So they are major advocates of what they call, what is called cognitive behavioral therapy. My wife's a professor of psychology, so I like to try to talk to her about this stuff once in a while. And here's what it says on page 46. The goal of cognitive behavioral therapy is to minimize distorted thinking and see the world more accurately, which means that our thinking is getting distorted by all kinds of things, namely emotions and kind of lack of reasoning. Now this is a great point because the authors are really kind of maybe even nosediving in a sense into this world of education that we're all a part of, and the relationship between professors, instructors, and students being offended by what professors are saying, right? So this has always been a problem, but in a politically correct culture where we're taking more and more offense and being more and more careful, this is having a consequence on professors who have to now be more and more careful here, right? They really do have, they word it nicely here. They say, a claim that someone's words are offensive is not just an expression of one's own subjective feeling of offendedness, right? Which means, let's say I'm sitting in class and the professor says something and I raise my hand and say, I'm offended by what you just said. So immediately, not only is it kind of this idea that my emotions have been affected, right? That I feel like I've been harassed, but it's rather a public charge that the speaker has done something objectively wrong. So because my emotions are being hurt by what the professor is saying, it's also because of this political correctness, this idea that the teacher or the professor is doing their job wrong, right, objectively, especially from an administrative point of view. Moving forward with the article, you definitely get the idea, I believe, that this is an ongoing feud between professors, what we call faculty, which I am, and a lot of outstanding faculty at Moorpark College. I'm very happy to be amongst them. And then, so you have professors and faculty, and then you have administration, the deans, the presidents, right? All the people with administrative power. Administrations are trying to be as politically correct as they possible, which they always have. And then we have professors, faculty who are wanting to fight back a little bit on that political correctness, right? For whatever reason, right? As we get into page 47, like I said, after they give us the terminology and kind of set us up, and I think it's a good way of composing this article, I think it's quite effective, they then give us all these different examples. They take us to all kinds of universities. I'm just looking at some of them here. It takes us to Notre Dame, where a Jewish student, straight from Israel, right, an Israeli student, uses the term water buffalo, says it at a black sorority sister because they're loud outside the window, and they took that as a racial slur, water buffalo. Well, again, the administration says, yep, put him in trouble. He's not, he shouldn't be saying those racial things against these black students. Well, if you think about it for a minute, water buffalo is definitely not your standard insult or derogatory term, degrading term against black people in this country. There's other words that fit that bill. So that doesn't really make sense, right? And also, when you look into it even more, when he used the term for water buffalo, it just meant loud people that he found very distracting and disruptive, and it had nothing to do with race, right? But that's the thing. How much are we looking into these cases on a case-by-case basis? What's the actual evidence? Because these charges of hate speech and harassment are serious. Trust me, nobody would want that on their record. I don't think anybody would ever, good luck getting a job in certain fields if that were to happen. So these are serious charges, and notice that people have to kind of protect their reputations at times. Another striking example here is Hump Day, where college students think it's a great idea to bring a camel on campus and pet it. I think it sounds horrible. There's so many bad reasons. I like to joke with my students when we're in class how many reasons how many bad reasons there are to bring a camel on a campus. But the one that ends up getting students riled up on campus, this political correctness we talk about, is they think it'll be insulting and discriminating against Middle Eastern students. But notice the irony here. Like, pause, so we're very careful. It's the students who are making that connection and that association of Middle East. No, I'm tying it together. Middle East and camels. Notice the students made that connection. Nobody else said it. They kind of plugged in the racist thought, the discriminatory thought. They plugged it in, and it really wasn't there to begin with, right? Because we know that Hump Day really just means Wednesday, and it means the hump on the camel's back, and it means that we're at Wednesday and now we're going down, right? It's kind of peak of the week. Now we're going down to Friday, TGIF, right? So it doesn't have any context in racial meaning, right? So looking into kind of more specifics, but you see how people are, as the authors kind of put it, I paraphrase, looking to be offended, right? And you can agree or disagree. They tend to make the case that, and share examples that show that there might be this, that people might be overdoing it. More seriously, they'll get into the consequences, I think, later in the piece. So the magic year is 2013. And what happens is the Departments of Justice and Education, they changed the rule about what can be seen as harassment speech. There used to be kind of a kind of criterion in place, some criteria, meaning it had to be like repetitive, there had to be a pattern of it, just like bullying. They say bullying isn't bullying unless it's happening kind of over and over, right? There has to be a pattern to it. So there was definitely some things. They had this average person for doing it. More seriously, they'll get into the consequences, I think, later in the piece. So the magic year is 2013. And what happens is the Departments of Justice and Education, they changed the rule about what can be seen as harassment speech. There used to be kind of a kind of criterion in place, some criteria, meaning it had to be like repetitive, there had to be a pattern of it, just like bullying. They say bullying isn't bullying unless it's happening kind of over and over, right? There has to be a pattern to it. So there was definitely some things. They had this average person test, which sounds like an interesting test, meaning would your average person get upset by the statement, right? And if the answer is no, that most people wouldn't, then it wouldn't be found as harassment. So there used to be certain ways of defining what it was, because people would get in trouble for it and they'd have to defend themselves, right? it changes in the magic year of 2013, where they say that now it's just anything that's unwelcome. And the problem with unwelcome is that it's just too vague. It can mean very different things to different people. If a woman, if I was a woman and a guy held the door for me, maybe for one particular woman that would be unwelcoming, right? And she has good reasons for it, but maybe for another woman she wouldn't make much of it, right? So now it's really up to anybody, as in that word unwelcome is too hazy, and that's what the authors are saying, is there's no real clear way now of knowing what meets the criteria for harassment speech, based on all those Title IX things that we were talking about, like age, sex, gender identity, etc., all those different things. One question we have here is one idea that comes to mind now is the result of all of this, the outcome on students, which might be this hypersensitivity. Interesting question for you to think about. As you're in college, you've been in probably a couple classes now, English, other classes where you're sharing ideas, talking, discussing, and do you feel like there's this hypersensitivity in place that is causing some kind of issue in the class or in the courses that you're taking? Another term that is shared here that I think many of you are probably familiar with at this point. I definitely wasn't the few years ago that I read this, started teaching it, trigger warnings. Where do these originally come from? Just to share what I've learned from the article, because this is really just me helping you understand the material. Hopefully it's helping you. All right, so trigger warnings, right? Didn't know what it was until I read this article, and to be honest, I can't say, apologize for a squealing puppy in the background. We just got a puppy a few days ago, and it's kind of like having a baby in the first few days, but okie dokie. Trigger warnings. So I've never actually issued one myself. What a trigger warning is when a teacher, professor feels like some students need a heads up on something that's going to happen in a text, or they're going to read about something or see something, and they want them to just have that heads up so that they aren't traumatized by what they see, especially for students that may have gone through similar issues or kind of connect to it in a way that speaks to the experiences that they've had. Where do trigger warnings originally come from? We find out from the article. It's a very interesting article from soldiers who have experienced difficult situations in war, seen people die, been through incredibly harrowing experiences, and they can speak to the horrors of that. And so sometimes if they see something, if they hear something, right, it can trigger that trauma in them, and they can go through, kind of relive those things, and we don't really want that happening, right? It's not a really good situation. So that's where trigger warnings come from, right? They're really applied to soldiers who might need a heads up on stuff they're about to see or get involved with, like fireworks. Tends to be the cliche example. Soldiers who have been at war, or sometimes you hear about guys when they hear a helicopter. Older vets, when they hear a helicopter, that might trigger a certain kind of sensation and memory, and it can be difficult. Then it starts to be applied online to what's happening with women with rape, right? And when they're reading about kind of rape culture, and when they're reading about things that are there, in any sense, they want to be careful about what they read, these women who have gone through these experiences, because it can re-trigger that trauma that they went through. And again, we don't want this happening, right? It's not a pleasant thing. It's a very troublesome thing indeed. So that's why they're there. However, now they're being applied in schools. You're going to read a story and they use the N-word. You're going to read a book and it's got a rape scene in it. You're going to read this. And so everyone is not only getting a heads up on it, what the trigger warning usually also comes with is an opt-out feature, meaning now you can opt out of reading that piece. And now this gets into the big debate. Should students be able to just opt out of anything they feel is going to make them uncomfortable, or should students have to go through that? Should they have to read it? And they're going to even get into the specific ideas of people dealing with trauma and something called habituation, which is getting them used to stimuli once again, even the certain things that they may have major fear, discomfort, and challenges with, but getting them back to being able to deal with things in a normal way instead of avoiding it, right? Oh, nope, not going to read that. See you later, right? Or take a different piece, right? Okay. Now, here's where trigger warnings, especially from my perspective and some of the literature I teach and some of the themes that seem to be important, this is where it gets a little dangerous, this political correctness, these trigger warnings. What the broadening kind of scope of what we're issuing trigger warnings for. It starts with war experiences, then it's about women with rape, now it's about seemingly everything, right? And we've really jumped to some massive level. And now that's the problem. What if certain topics that we should be talking about, the one I like to point out here is classism. What is classism? You may have never heard of it before. Just like there's racism, there's sexism, there's ageism, there's classism. Classism is the antagonistic feelings that flow between different social classes, rich, poor, rich, middle class, poor, so on and so forth. And that breaks down into, quite a spectrum indeed, the poverty class, etc. And so you can start to, because this scope of what you can issue trigger warnings is expanding, you can issue it toward anything now, including classism, which is about these feelings of people, rich, poor, middle class, etc. And so you're creating a fear of either talking about those issues or even allowing students to opt out of those discussions, or maybe even censoring a teacher professor's choice of what to teach, or their what they express, what they say, their content as well, right? And should something like classism be something that's restricted from classroom discussions when we talk about rich people and poor people and middle class people? Should that be something where there's kind of a bar on it? Can't talk about it. People's feelings might get hurt, and you ask yourself the question, well, whose feelings would get hurt talking about these issues, right? And you can start to think of some answers. I'm not too sure. It might be a more difficult question than I think. So we have the things I had mentioned briefly before. I'll mention them briefly now. Exposure therapy by Ivan Pavlov, right, in the world of psychology. And this is leads to habituation, which just means that somebody who's gone through a really negative experience with something. I'll take the example of rape, a woman who's been raped. It's about getting them used to some kind of normal living after an experience like that, as normal as it can get. Because it's not just a fear of rape, right? That's obvious, but it could be a fear now of a building because that's where it happened. Or it might be a fear of even going out at night now because of what happened, right? There's all kinds of incredible little fears that probably start to pile up. So we want to be able to get back to as normal of a life as possible, right? So the idea is getting them back step by step. Maybe one day. And they use the example of an elevator. I think they try to use a more rather kind of benign example, right? Not many people, I think, have that kind of phobia. But even with the rape example, if I keep going with that, it's like, okay, well, today we're going to at least go down that street again, right? We're going to go down that main road and drive by, maybe somewhere in the vicinity of where it happened, and just trying to get over that fear. I mean, it sounds like a very difficult thing, but that's their idea. And they feel like you can also project that onto the educational scene as well, meaning that the more and more we have these difficult conversations in class and disagree and share opinions, even if it gets heated, etc., it's still kind of getting us used to kind of, conversation by conversation, it's getting us used to talking in general, right? And really trying to share ideas with each other instead of this kind of culture that loves to kind of butt heads and not accomplish much in terms of conversations, right? And these, because of the political correctness, perhaps, that's restricting it as well. They make the point, and I've taught this in high school many times, and high school students like to think about this, like if you don't start challenging yourself now in terms of disagreeing with people and hearing them and not getting emotionally riled up when you do this, then they say if you can't do it now in classrooms that are designed for this, good luck in the real world when it happens in the street, or when it happens in an office meeting, or it happens at a wedding, or it happens somewhere else, right? And again, a great time to see what you think. Do you agree with that? You think, yeah, this is the time to learn how to debate and have difficult conversations based on how we think and how we believe in classrooms, so that we get to the real world and we can do this? Or or not? Or do we kind of avoid it, and also avoid it in real world? My wife tells me, you know, she told me on occasion when we go to like a new place and we're meeting new people, she'll say, don't talk about politics, right? Because it's just one of those things that maybe we don't do enough of, and so that it can lead to awkward situations. You don't have the real time to do it, right? So I'll let you be the judge of that. Start to talk about the impact. This is page 49, just the impact on professors, right? The impact on their teaching. If you've gotten in trouble for saying something, and I'm the type of professor where I say what I want to say based on what I've read and what I've learned, etc. But at the same time, I'm kind of careful, and I know I'm walking a fine line, and I've been teaching for a long time now, and you definitely kind of change the way you deliver content, right? It does happen, but I'm still teaching what I want to teach, and I've never really had any issues there. And I think a lot of students find it interesting. Not everybody. Can't please everybody, right? But you could imagine that if you've really gotten, some of us know teachers or professors that have probably gotten into some issues with this, saying a certain thing in class, or really it comes down to speech. Then it's going to impact. I mean, they share some examples here that are kind of scattered, and some of them are quite dramatic, but of professors who have really had their lives majorly affected by what they've said and the consequences and the repercussions that have come down on them, right? Because of the administration, who is politically correct as can be, finding issue with what they said or how they handled themselves in a situation. On page 51 of this article, this is where they have a kind of graphic here that shares all 12 of the common cognitive distortions, and I think it's always helpful to go through that with maybe a loved one, somebody you live with, whatever, somebody online, and you can read these and say, like, put your hand up every time you think this kind of speaks to an issue the way you think, right? And there's definitely some here. One that I love to point out is negative filtering, right? Where things in your life are going quite well, but you focus on one little detail. Employers do this a lot, believe it or not. I felt this before, where you could have a rather gleaming record of a year and you did awesome and there were so many nice things to say, but they want to talk about the one thing that needs addressing, right? The one thing they consider an issue. So it's this negative filtering, when you filter just for the one negative thing instead of the myriad of positives that might be there, right? If you really start to look at the bigger picture. Blaming, I teach high school, so whenever I get to that one, I'm like, how many of you think you like to blame other people for problems? You could imagine a lot of the hands go up, maybe even still the hands are going up. Like I said, it's always fun to go through this and see what the problem is, what the authors feel is the main issue, which is these common cognitive distortions, these emotional ways that we think. And without real reason or evidence, it's reasoning without evidence, because it's based on emotions, right? But no evidence, right? And that's kind of how it breaks down. At the end of the article, I do think the authors do a nice job of summing up kind of all their major points, reminding us, in fact, of some of the major terminology once again. They give a lot of their own suggestions as to what they think could be helpful as we are dealing with educational environments inundated by political correctness and policies of political correctness and anti-harassment speech. This is now obviously a conversation to have about online servers, online companies such as YouTube, and with so much content out there, and who's being the judge of what's appropriate, what's not, and even worse, what's offensive, what's considered as harassment, and even grounds for lawsuits and legal action. So that's when you get to a pretty intense level. But it's happening every day. It's probably happening all around us. The discussion posts are designed for you to now start to share your opinions and perspectives, having a clarity to the article, kind of understanding the context. That's what this lecture and the lectures of this MO2 class will largely do, is just help you better understand material so that you can write about it more effectively and with more clarity as well. You know, I would say teaching, I'll just kind of bring it full circle in the last 2 minutes here. This is one of the most important pieces I read, and I think it's because I read it at an important time. When I was a teacher who obviously, based on the literature I've read, you know, I'm very aware of the isms, the racism, the sexism. When you read articles in literature, at least as an English teacher, I'm big on history as well. Don't really read a lot of the history stuff, but you're aware of all of these things. And you get to this point where that seems like the biggest virtue of all is political correctness. And I think in many regards it still is. We have to remember there's real benefits to political correctness. Broadening the literary canon for more diverse voices. Things have taken place that have led to more voices being included in this American experience. But at the same time, it's the reason this was important for me at that time to read this was maybe it can go too far. Right now we're starting to see the pendulum shift in such a way where voices are being subdued and certain issues that are massively important are now being kind of restricted and barred from students being able to talk about them, or there's just too much discomfort. And what the authors are saying is if we handle our minds a little bit more, we can handle the discussions a little bit more, not overreact emotionally, and maybe these conversations, no matter how much we disagree, can go somewhere, or can at least be had with more kind of composure and clarity, right? Hopefully you enjoyed this piece. I think it's a nice way to begin any semester because we're going to be talking about all kinds of issues. And I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all safe. I hope you're all healthy. And I will see you next time.